It is often said that one person's misfortune is another person's opportunity. And while this may be true in some cases, it was certainly not true for the 20 to 30 million people who lost their lives during the bubonic plague. While the effects of the Black Death were mostly negative, there were some benefits which we will explore in today's video. Like today, diseases could spread easily across Europe because of the lack of effective medical treatments. In fact, the only real treatment at the time was rest. If it was airborne, it would attack the lungs first. So how did it affect the world around them? First of all, it devastated Europe. The plague also killed animals, and this had a profound impact on the feudal system in Europe. One group in particular was the religious order called the Flagellants. They believed that God was punishing Europe for its sins, and they wanted to show God that they were sorry. Historians continue to debate the effects of the plague on Europe and how it shaped the continent. But some historians argue that the plague did have some positive effects. For example, it helped to improve working conditions for peasants, and it also paved the way for the rise of capitalism. But overall, the Black Death was a horrible event in history, and it's important to remember the millions of people who lost their lives. Some historians argue that the Black Death was actually beneficial for Europe because it helped to end feudalism and pave the way for capitalism. Others argue that the devastation caused by the plague was too great and that there is no way that it could have been beneficial in any way. To do this, they would flagellate themselves, meaning they would beat themselves as a form of penance. They would march from town to town, whipping themselves as they went. They attracted a lot of attention, and eventually the authorities in some towns banned them. But even though they were stopped, the flagellants proved that people were desperate to find an explanation for the plague. Some people even started blaming women for the outbreak, and this led to the burning of witches. Remember, people didn't know what caused the plague, so they just started blaming things. And since they had heard stories of evil witches causing disasters before, they decided that this was probably what was happening. You see, until the Middle Ages, serfs worked the land owned by nobles. And in return, the nobles would protect the serfs and make sure they had enough to eat. However, after the plague killed off so many peasants and farm animals, there weren't enough farmers to work the land. This meant that the nobles no longer had complete control over the serfs. In fact, the power dynamic shifted and the serfs were now in a good position to negotiate better working conditions and higher wages. The power that the nobles had held for so long finally started to slip away, and this led to the decline of feudalism in Europe. Between 1346 and 1353, it's estimated that 25 million Europeans died. Some places were completely wiped out. Entire villages would vanish overnight. We've already talked about how the power dynamic between nobles and serfs changed after the plague. Well, this also applied to merchants and artisans. Before the plague, merchants and artisans were often looked down upon by the nobility. After the plague, however, they were in a much better position. For example, because there weren't enough farmers, food prices skyrocketed. This meant that merchants who sold food became very wealthy. Also, since there was less demand for farm labor, merchants and artisans could hire people for cheaper. In addition to that, the nobility had been greatly weakened by the plague. Many noble families lost huge numbers of people, and this left them unable to defend their lands. As a result, some powerful merchant families took over and established powerful Italian states like Venice, Florence, and Genoa. Also, since people had no idea what caused the plague, they were desperate to find an explanation. And they found one in groups of people who were different. For example, some people blamed Jews because they had recently converted to Christianity. Others blamed Christians because they had recently converted to Islam, and still others blamed merchants because they were in contact with foreigners. Of course, none of this made any sense. In fact, it's thought that the Black Death arrived in Europe via trading ships from Asia, but people just couldn't understand that. And so entire groups of people were persecuted for being different. Pogroms were held against the Jews, and this led to more deaths. Unfortunately, when something bad happens and people don't know why, they often look for someone to blame. And this can still be seen today. If it was transmitted by rats, it would start in the lymph nodes. But either way, the results were pretty much the same. People would experience fever, weakness, chills, aches and pains, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. These symptoms lasted for about a week. Then, if the person survived, the buboes, or swollen lymph nodes, would appear. They could grow to be the size of an apple and be very painful. Eventually, they would burst and the person would hopefully recover. But if they didn't, they would experience bleeding, gangrene, fever, delirium, and convulsions. Finally, the person would go into a coma and die. Only 25% of the people who contracted the plague survived, and many of those who did were horribly disfigured due to the buboes. But unlike today, the people of Europe had no idea what actually caused diseases like the bubonic plague. Their best guess was that diseases were caused by an imbalance of the four humors or fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. So to rebalance these humors, they did things like leeching, which is the process of sucking blood out of the body, drinking large amounts of wine, and even using laxatives. None of this helped against the bubonic plague. Make sure to watch until the end because the last one might surprise you. But for some survivors of the Black Death, as it was known, there may have been some silver linings. This was the worst plague in human history, and it happened in Europe between 1346 and 1353. It killed an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. While many people lost their lives, some managed to survive, and they lived in a world that had changed dramatically from how it was before the plague. But first, what caused the plague? The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. So now we know what the disease was and how people tried to treat it, but where did it come from? Well, the answer is rats. The bacteria that caused the plague lived in rodents, most notably rats, and they lived alongside humans all throughout Europe. For example, London at the time had a rat problem so bad that people had to wade through piles of them in the streets. But where did the rats get the disease from? Most likely they got it from wild rats and mice. And where did they get it from? Nobody knows. But once the disease started spreading, it spread fast. The symptoms of the plague varied depending on how someone was infected. Now we know how horrible the plague was and how it affected the survivors. After the plague hit Europe, people started blaming other groups of people for the disaster. But it wasn't just people who were affected. Not everyone was happy with these changes. In fact, right after the plague, some groups of people wanted to go back to how things were before. But not everyone was hurting from the plague. In fact, for some people, it was a great opportunity. In fact, the Black Death had such a profound impact on European society that it's still studied today. As we've seen, the Black Death was a terrible disaster for Europe, and it's hard to imagine how it could have been beneficial in any way.